You've been hearing us talk about imperial yeast for a while now, and that's because we absolutely love this stuff. With 200 billion cells in each pitch-right pouch, we rarely even need to make starters these days. Unfortunately, not everybody has the access to imperial yeast those of us out here on the West Coast do, because they're based out of Portland, Oregon. But things are about to change. Imperial Yeast is excited to announce the opening of their East Coast location, which is huge for those who want the freshest yeast possible with the best pitch rates, but brew on the other side of the country. They're going to start by offering their four most popular strains, A38 Juice, A07 Flagship, L13 Global, and GO3 Dieter, with the goal of providing their full lineup of yeast by mid-2021. So start your planning now at imperialyeast.com. As simple as brewing a batch of beer feels to those of us who have been doing it for a while, there are actually quite a few steps involved in the process, particularly for certain brewing methods. Traditionally, once the mash rest is complete, the sweet wort is collected while water is sprinkled over the grains, thus rinsing residual sugar off those grains and into the boil kettle. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and in this episode, I'm joined by contributor Cade Jobe to talk not just about the sparge step, but the impact temperature of the water used to sparge with can have on beer.
Yeah, so I remember this was Ray Found did this experiment a few years ago, and I remember when this came out, and I remember thinking, wow, it's something I never even considered, which is what we'll be talking about today, sparging, but also the temperature of your sparge water. So doing it cool versus your standard, 170 degree sparge water. And this one, whenever it came out, I remember being really fascinated by this because I was thinking, oh, that's something I've never even thought of doing before, but maybe it can be helpful. So I think we're going to have some fun today talking about this one.
Yeah, well, judging by the results of our last couple general homebrewer surveys, a survey that we send out every year just to see, kind of gauge where people are in their home brewing, there are quite a few brewers out there who have completely ditched the whole sparge step, opting instead to use like full volume mashing methods, brew in a bag, stuff like that. I definitely count myself among that group these days, though I have experience brewing with pretty much every method out there. And to my knowledge, sparging is still widely practiced on the commercial brewing level, in large part, I believe, because you can eke a bit more extraction out of, get more sugars out of those grains. So I do look forward to digging into this interesting topic with you, Cade. Well, as we approach the end of this wonky year, having just finished celebrating Thanksgiving here in the United States, I can't help but reflect a bit on where we're at and perhaps get a bit sentimental as well. That's just my nature. When I realized COVID was a big deal that was going to throw a wrench in our ability to do what we're most known for, which is collect data from participants, I was pretty anxious about how it was going to affect us in general, and started planning for the worst. Thankfully, we have been able to weather the storm without much damage, which is hugely due to the support of our patrons, those people who appreciate what we do enough to make a small monthly pledge that allows us to keep doing this thing. So to all of our patrons, you are very special to us, and we hope that you enjoy the rewards that you get in exchange for your support. For those who are interested in joining this awesome group of people, you can go to patreon.com/brewlosophy to check out all of the rewards you can get for helping us out. Stuff like access to unpublished recipes, patron-only discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Coming up later this month is one of my favorite people in Yakima, Washington, Nathan Cooper from Wandering Hop Brewery. As a resident of Hop Country, Nathan focuses primarily on IPA, particularly of the hazy New England subset. And he also has tons of experience brewing with fresh, or what people call wet hops. To be a part of this session, you have to make your pledge by December 18th, 2020, as Nathan will be taking questions on December 19th. And all past sessions are stored on our private Facebook page, so patrons can go back and watch them whenever they like. Become a patron today at patreon.com/brewlosophy. Another really easy way to support us is by using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support when you're doing your shopping online. Your shopping experience will not change at all. You don't even notice you're using that link, and we get a little kickback. With it being Christmas right now and everybody being home, we know a lot of you are doing your shopping online, so if you'd be so kind as to think of us first, that'd be really cool. Finally, if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and a review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we'd really appreciate it. All right, feedback is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who specialize in tri-clover compatible sanitary fittings, conical fermenters, kettles, and brew stands. Brewers Hardware offers a variety of unique items for home and craft brewers, including high-quality stainless fittings at great prices with super fast shipping. Learn more at brewershardware.com, and don't forget to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. That's brewershardware.com. Ben Flowers from London, England wrote in to say, I only got into brewing since the COVID lockdown happened in April, but have jumped in two-footed and am absolutely loving it. After a bad experience using a bucket, I decided to upgrade to a Fermenter King Jr., which is an amazing PET pressurized fermentation vessel that can hold up to 35 psi and allows for sealed transfers to direct serve, and also comes with a floating pickup line so no cutting of the dip tube is needed. I was a tad disappointed this type of vessel didn't get a shout out in the fermentation vessels episode, as I think it's a super cheap and awesome product. I believe this product that he's talking about is similar to what we have here in the States called a Firmzilla fermentation vessel. I'm not entirely sure. While I've heard good things about it, I've never used one, so I can't really comment on it, but it sounds like a cool fermenter.
That's pretty impressive if it's a PET fermenter that also you can pressurize up to 35 psi.
Yeah.
I mean, that's quite a substantial pressure when you're thinking about it for plastic especially. But that's really cool. I think it is similar to the Firmzilla like you're talking about, Marshall, but I've never used that kind of fermenter before. But man, okay, so you started this... Mr. Flowers started in April, and he's already upgraded and doing pressure transfers to minimize CO2.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, I would say you definitely jumped in with both feet, and you're listening to our podcast, which is fantastic. So so keep up the good work, man.
Yeah, Ben, I mean, seriously, I can sort of relate. I was a bit slower to get that obsessed, but I do appreciate the fact that people are jumping in and doing the best they can to make the best beer possible. I think that's pretty cool. Thank you so much for the feedback, Ben. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. Sadly, Jersey, Tim, and I have still yet to find a time to get together to review listener-submitted beers, but that is about to change. I'm so excited to finally announce that we've been able to schedule something on the calendar. It's for a couple of weeks from now, so it's going to be a couple more episodes before we get back to reviewing those beers. I counted them up. I think I've got about 14 beers sitting in the fridge right now. None of them are too old, but I do want to let everyone know who has sent in beers that we are going to get to them. You are going to get credit for them. And yeah, we're going to get back to normal. So thank you for sending those beers in. It will be another couple of weeks, but Jersey and Tim will be back. All right, we've got to cut to a quick break. When we come back, the focus will be on sparging. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all-grain beer in a single, compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high-quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to Grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to Grainfather.com, that's Grainfather.com, and get started today.
Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. Having brewed 3 or 4 extract with steeping grains batches of beer, I went to my local homebrew shop to pick up some ingredients and struck up a conversation with the dude working there. He noticed that I was clearly hooked on this beer making thing and suggested I jump over to all grain brewing. Now, this was back in 2003. I was about a year out from getting married, moving to a different state, and starting grad school. So after he explained the entire all grain process to me, I very swiftly bought some extract and steeping grains and got the hell out of the brew shop. Back then, the most common approach to brewing was what's known as fly sparge, which sounded way more convoluted than what I was doing. It had multiple vessels. You had to keep water warm. And as the name implied, a major component to this method was sparging, which is believed to serve a rather important purpose.
Yeah, so I think at this point, I've done almost all of the different sparging methods, at least myself, or at least have seen it done, where I was, sort of participating in the brew. I up until I got the new set of equipment, the new electric equipment that's brew in a basket. I did fly sparging, and so I think this episode, especially, we're going to talk about sparging and what that is. I think a lot of brewers still out there are doing it, and we'll talk a little bit in a minute about the different types of sparging, and specifically what we focused on, or what Ray focused on in his experiment. But I think, like you were talking about, Marshall, it's important that we start at the top, which is what exactly is sparging,
right?
And so, if to me, it's pretty simple. You're just rinsing the grains to collect as much of the fermentable sugars as possible. Now, that's kind of an oversimplified way of thinking about it, but that's really the main benefit, or at least the main purported benefit of sparging. So running that sugary wort from either the bottom of your mash tun or out of a grain bag, or just, sucking the wort off of the grains and running that to the kettle. That's sparging, or at least that's how I define sparging.
Well, and that's the thing. So I don't want this to turn into a lesson in linguistics or anything, but sparge is a German term, and there are a lot of German terms that we use in brewing. We've kind of stolen from that language. When I use Google Translate, sparge translates to save. What I was always taught was that sparge means rinse, and that's really what's happening. But I kind of trust Google Translate more than I do the local homebrew shop guy, So I am curious, and I know, again, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but I am curious why it's called that. What are we saving? There's got to be something about it, or maybe sparge is one of those words that has multiple meanings in German. I don't know.
Maybe. I mean, I could also see, because especially in the commercial brewery, we're looking constantly at the certificate of analysis that comes with the malt grains. Mm-hmm. And a couple things on that certificate of analysis. Well, first of all, the certificate of analysis tells you certain things about the malt that you got, that specific lot of malt. So not just generally like pale malt or maris otter or anything, but the specific bags or the specific lot number that you're getting. It tells you a bunch of things, which is probably way more advanced than we need to go into in this podcast. But two of the things are fine grind extract and coarse grind extract. And what that is essentially the manufacturer of the maltster telling you, hey, brewer, these are two numbers of what concentration of sugars you should get out of this malt. We've done a couple of, the maltster saying we've done a couple of tests under rigorous scientific conditions, and we've come up with these two sort of measures about what kind of extract, what kind of fermentable sugars you should get out of this when you do the mash. And so if you think about sparging, if you didn't get that efficiency that it says on the certificate of analysis or something, I could certainly see brewers going, I wonder if I just left some sugar in the mash, thinking, okay, maybe I can rinse that out to get that number, to get the maximum extract potential out. So maybe I'm saving the other sugars that are still in there.
Sure.
maybe a hard way to think about it, but rinsing it out and saving the full extract potential of the wort. So I'm saving grain, I'm saving costs and all that stuff. I don't know. I kind of just pulled that out, but but it kind of makes sense to me.
Well, and from the perspective of a commercial brewer, where love it or hate it, their goal is to make money. It's to be able to survive while doing something they love. I get that, but they want to capitalize on their product that they're making and they're selling. And the best way to do that is to get the most extract out of those grains possible. You don't want to be throwing away essentially money. And so by sparging, if you imagine how much sugar is left in those spent grains after your first runoff, if you collect that first volume of sweet wort, there's a reason people sparge, particularly on the commercial scale. Now we know that home brewers, especially a while ago, I don't want to say in the beginning because I feel like brewing has always been kind of a home thing, but 20, 30 years ago, all we were doing was mimicking what we saw in commercial breweries. And so it makes sense to me that we adopted this practice of sparging. Now, just a quick note, I know that this is a show where we are going to focus on sparging. In our latest general homebrewer survey, 29% of people do brew in a bag. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not rinsing the bag of grains. I know some people do that, but most people I know who are brewing BIAB are not rinsing their grains. They're pulling it out, they're giving it a gentle squeeze, and they're tossing those grains. Another 27% are brewing like you and me nowadays on one of these all-in-one electric systems, which are generally based on brew in a bag. Oftentimes there's a basket, so brew in a basket, if you will. And then another 3% endorsed no sparge brewing, which just means they're doing full volume mashes and then skipping the whole sparge step. For me as a home brewer, what I've noticed is I consistently get about 67 to 70% efficiency when I'm doing these either a brew in a bag or a no sparge batch, which is only about 3 or 4% brew house efficiency less, so a small hit than when I was doing batch sparge. And then with the few times that I did do a fly sparge, I saw a huge bump in that extract. So I'm getting like 80% when I fly sparge. So again, just to note that it does seem to really impact the extract efficiency when you perform a fly sparge.
Yeah, for sure. Those numbers in terms of efficiency are exactly been my experience. So I started off whenever I was brewing, doing like you did. I started with extracts, eventually went to steeping some specialty grains. And then whenever I made the jump to doing all grain, I was doing batch sparging originally, which we'll talk about in a minute what that is. And then I went to full volume mash, and then still didn't like my efficiency numbers just because I was pursuing efficiency at the time, and then went to fly sparging. And whenever I did that, I saw much higher efficiency, like you said, up in the 80s whenever I was fly sparging. Now that I'm doing the electric systems, so brew in a basket, if you will, that efficiency's back down in the 70s. So that's about a 10% efficiency difference. Now for a home brewer, that's really not much, right? No. That's a handful of grains at the most. We're talking maybe $1 more on the cost of the batch. But for a commercial brewer, especially when you're getting up into the insane, not insane, but the really big batches, 100 and 200 barrel batches, 10% is thousands of dollars,
right?
And so I can certainly see why that makes sense. And if we look back, I think we talked about it on the Belgian double episode. I got it right. We talked about how they taxed mash tuns, and this wasn't unique to Belgium. This happened all over the world, where there was a period of time where mash tuns were being taxed. So if you just filled it with the maximum amount of grain that you could, and then did a mash, added some water, rinsed that off, did a mash, added some water, rinsed that off, you could really extend the amount of beer that you got out of that mash. So to me, that makes a lot of sense. And like you said, we looked at these commercial breweries doing this as home brewers and sort of mimicked it. But today, at least as far as I know, most commercial breweries are still fly sparging with their equipment. I don't know very many. I think it'd be kind of impossible to do you'd have to have a really massive bag to do a like 100 barrel brew in a bag. But,
I had Tommy actually actually, just a note on that. When he started off, I believe he was doing a 3-barrel nano brewing system. He's now got 15-barrel system and all that, but he was doing brew in a bag. And it was wild. The bag that he had, he'd send us photos of when he was pulling the grain bag out, and it was just massive. I mean, hundreds of pounds of grains in there. So
you
pretty funny.
Had to have like a forklift or something.
Oh yeah, for sure. Or a wench or something like that. But
yeah.
So now, again, we've established that a lot of people are not using these sparge methods anymore. But the fact that the monikers that we give these different brewing methods often include the word sparge is kind of an indication to me that that it's a fairly important part of the process. And so let's break down a little bit what these different sparge methods are, or these mash methods really. But we've been talking about fly sparge. Again, that is your very traditional, you've mashed and then you've waited your 60 minutes or however long your mash rest is, and it's time to collect that sweet wort. So a fly sparge, basically, the way I've heard it described that I like the best is that you're creating kind of a squeegee effect with water. So as you're running off that sweet wort, you're also adding warm water to the top. It's usually, they say the ideal temperature is 170 degrees Fahrenheit or 67 degrees Celsius. And so you're sprinkling that water over the top. You want it to be as even as possible so that you don't create channels in the grain. And then as you're collecting those first runnings, you're also adding that water. So it's squeezing that or rinsing that residual sugar off of those grains. There's multiple ways to do this on the homebrew scale. I have a friend who I believe still brews this way. He uses a 10-gallon, round cooler, and then he just gets a measuring cup, like a big measuring cup, and gently, as he's running off his sweet wort, he just gently, pours water over his grains. And he's one of those guys who gets like 82% efficiency every time. It works for him. And so that's why he does it. My experience with fly sparging, like I said earlier, I do get better efficiency, but it's kind of a pain in the butt, and it seems to take a long time.
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly fly sparge definitely requires the most equipment, right? Because you have to have I guess we'll see if you have to have, but in most cases you have an additional kettle where you're keeping warm liquid or hot liquor.
Yeah.
Right. And then you're using that hot liquor and spraying it over the grain beds to rinse, so that means that you essentially have to have at least 3 vessels. You have to have a mash tun, a vessel that's holding hot water, and your boil kettle.
Right.
Right. For a lot of people, and especially as homebrewers, most homebrewers don't want to buy and have 3 sets of equipment or three vessels that they have to use every time.
Yeah.
So it makes a lot of sense that from homebrewers, we're sort of switching away from that.
Yeah.
Most commercial breweries are set up with a hot liquor tank that continuously has hot water, not even just necessarily for brew house purposes, but all throughout the brewery. Wherever water is going to be needed. So again, it's not as much of a concern for a commercial brewer. And but yeah, fly sparge, I like to think of it as like a continuous running water over the top, kind of like you're showering the grains, right? You're showering and washing all those sugars off.
Yeah.
So that's what, and again, like you said, 82% efficiency at a homebrew scale is really good, and at a brewery, that's pretty good too. Getting all that sugar worts out of there. So that's why I did it whenever I started fly sparging, because I wanted to make sure I was getting as much sugars out. The other thing with fly sparging is you can be a little bit more consistent. Or at least I've found my efficiency is much tighter. The range of efficiency from batch to batch is much tighter, within 1 or 2 percentage points, brewing the same recipe. Whereas it may be not too much larger, but maybe 5 percentage points on an electric system or something.
Yeah.
So from a consistency perspective, because you're just running water off on the top of that grain until you get either to the right volume that you're looking for, or to the right level of sugars in the runnings that are coming off of that mash tun.
Yeah.
When you're fly sparging. But
well, I'm certainly not the only one who was hesitant to jump into all grain brewing back in the early 2000s when fly sparge was kind of the only approach. I mean, when Mars, the dude at North Corner Brew Supply in Bellingham, Washington, was explaining this process to me, and he was doing that thing where he's like, "Yeah, man, it's so easy. Once you get going," I was like, "Dude, there's no way I want to have 2 kettles and then something to hold hot water and then have to heat that water." And we'll get to that here in a sec. And, so I just kept brewing extract with steeping grains. I think it was around that time, and Denny Kahn gets a lot of credit for introducing the whole batch sparge thing or making it visible to brewers. But it was around that time that people started using converted cooler mash tuns and doing what we now refer to as batch sparge process. That the reason it's called that is because as opposed to continuously running water over the grains, once you fully collect your first runnings of sweet wort, you then add your entire sparge volume, give the grains another stir, and then you collect your second running. So you're sparging in batches as opposed to continuously. That was a very, very popular method when I got into all grain brewing. It's what I started with. And as recently as 2018, 33% of people who responded to our survey, which I think is a decent picture of the modern homebrewer, 33% of people, a whole third of homebrewers that's brew in a bag. 30% were using batch sparge, the batch sparge method. That's a lot. Now you look at 2020, that was 2018, just 2 years ago. In 2020, we're down to 22%. In just 2 years, 8% of people have not done that. And what we're seeing is a rise in these all-in-one electric systems. Now, again, some of those systems like the Grainfather still do rely on a sparge to rinse those grains. So that doesn't say much about that. But I do think it's interesting how popular batch sparge got when only about 19 to 20% of people consistently over the last 3 years at least have reported that they use a continuous or fly sparge method.
Yeah, I mean, batch sparge, that's still 1 in 5 homebrewers. So it's still a pretty large portion of homebrewers are using batch sparging.
Yeah.
But like you, Marshall, that's what I originally transitioned to from extract when I started doing full grain, all grain batches, full volume, all grain batches. I started doing batch sparging, and I found that to be really nice because then you could just heat up your water, dump it in a bucket, and then pour the bucket over. Heat up the water, dump it in a cooler or a bucket, and let it sit there while you're running off the runnings into your kettle.
Yep.
And then just rinse it right over the top of those grains. Let it sit for a couple of minutes, and then draw that off. And that I thought that was a really fantastic way of brewing for a long time. And then, like I said, I did start to notice some inconsistencies sort of in the amount of sugars that I got out of the wort from batch to batch. And also it sort of coincided with, I was just upgrading my mash tun and some additional equipment. And so that's why I eventually went to fly sparging, with a continuous sort of water stream going on the top. But yeah, batch sparging is a really, really popular way to do it. I think it's, even though it's reduced its popularity, it's still 1 in 5 brewers are doing batch sparging these days.
Yeah.
And, doing that, rinsing the grains with the batch sparge is also easier. It's sort of a middle method, I guess, to what we're doing. To the brew in a bag or brew in a basket or even full volume mashes or no sparge methods. But it seems to achieve that same purpose as a fly sparge by just requiring a little bit less equipment.
Yeah. I loved batch sparging when I got into it. This was, when I started all grain, I'd never heard of any other methods but fly sparge and batch sparge. And I just learned of batch sparging. And so it was so simple. And the approach that I took as I was mashing, I'd warm up the sparge water. So during the mash rest, I'd get that sparge water up to 170-ish degrees Fahrenheit or 67 C. And then that would be in my kettle. And so then I'd collect the first runnings in a bucket, which a lot of people poo-pooed, but it worked beautifully for me. And this allowed me to use just a single kettle. So I'd collect the first runnings in a bucket. I'd add that entire batch of sparge water that was 170 degrees Fahrenheit. I'd mix it up. I'd pour the sweet wort that's in the bucket back into the kettle. I'd let the sparge sit for about 5 minutes just to let those grains settle back out. Collect those second runnings, add them to the kettle, and then I'd proceed with the boil. The whole thing about temperature was something that, that was one of those things where I read, you got to get it up to 170. Beersmith just kind of tells you to do that. I never really questioned doing it any other way. It just made sense to me that you would want to kind of match the temperature. Or I guess it's a little bit warmer. Now, one of the big benefits that I was told about warmer mash temperatures, and there are people out there who were saying, well, you want that water to be about 180 so that when you add it to the grains, it's going to cool down a little bit because your mash is around 150-ish or so. And so it's going to cool down a bit. You want it to be around 170 once it's incorporated into the grains. And what it'll do is it'll loosen things up a bit. So that it's going to allow you to pull more of those sugars off of those grains. I only ever did it that way, so I never noticed if it did or it didn't, but it worked.
Yeah, you hit on a couple of things there. Actually, several things. But yeah, that 170 or 67 or it may be 77C. Actually, I'm sorry if I don't get the conversion right. I apologize. But that 170F or 170 Fahrenheit temperature is what you want inside the grain bed. It's not necessarily the water that you're sparging with. It's what is the actual resultant temperature of the grain. Now, why is that 170 this like magical special number? Well, it's kind of interesting on this, and I will say that the picture is cloudy. There's kind of a pun intended there, out of which I'll get to later, but it's not as clear cut as everybody sort of thinks. Now, like you, Marshall, I heard this 170 number, and because I read it, I think it's probably in John Palmer's book, How to Brew, because that was one of the first books that I read when I started brewing.
Oh yeah.
And he says heat your water up to 170 and do I think a batch sparge method in at least the original versions of How to Brew. And so that's exactly why I did it. And then you read in a bunch of other places, and it's pretty widespread, even in commercial textbooks, commercial brewing textbooks. It says 170 Fahrenheit is the level that you want to get that water to. And there's a bunch of different reasons for that. One of them is, like you said, that sugars dissolve better at warmer temperatures, right? And I think John Palmer had a really good sort of way to describe this is, think about like pouring cool honey versus warm honey out of a jar.
Right.
It just pours so much easier whenever it's warmer.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that there are enzymes that are working in that mash at those temperatures that you're mashing at, in the mid 140s up to the mid 150s. But when you get up over 170 degrees, or we'll say it's 170 degrees. When you get up over that magic number, those enzymes start to denature and they stop doing their function, which means they stop converting sugars. You can control where the mash starts and stops. And as a commercial brewer, that's another, and even a home brewer, that's another lever you can pull whenever you're doing and designing recipes and trying to make that perfect beer. If I know I can cut off the enzymes at this point, that makes a lot of sense. Now, I say the picture is cloudy in this because of all those things. I mean, for example, sugar dissolving better. Well, the sugar's already at 150 degrees. Is there really all that big of a difference between 155 versus 170 degrees whenever you're running off the sugars? And then the other thing about enzymes denaturing, yes, that's true too, but especially depending on your mash method, you may have already converted all of the sugars.
Yeah.
And so denaturing the enzymes may not do much at all. So again, that's kind of why I say the picture is cloudy about that 170F, but it's a really fascinating part of brewing, in my opinion.
Well, and it's, again, and I do stand corrected. It is 77C in an episode that is about temperature. I should get my conversions correct, and I typoed in my notes here, but 170F is 77C for those of you out there who do not follow us weird Americans with the whole Fahrenheit thing. We are going to refer to Fahrenheit more often in this episode. I promise you that, because that's what's normal for us. But yeah, it was one of those parts of the process that I just never really thought about. I never questioned. What I remember hearing more than anything was make sure you don't add water that's too hot, because there are issues that can happen if that water gets too warm and you add it to those your kind of dry grains. Now they're wet still, but you've already collected those the sweet wort, and then you add this hot water. What I was always told, the big bogeyman, was tannins. You can extract tannins, and it's going to make your beer astringent and horrible. So make sure you don't add water that's too warm. Was that something that, I know that in fly sparging and bat sparging, there are different concerns related to tannin extraction, but in general, the heat of the water was one that always got talked about.
Oh, for sure, yeah, and I heard this all the time. I mean, about husk tannins being extracted,
right?
From when you're fly sparging, when you over sparge a mash, that's the one that we hear about all the time, and that's what they're talking about either running off too much water at too high of a pH, so changing the pH, and or putting in too hot of water into the mash, and you're getting these husk tannins out. Now, this one is also one that I'll say has been somewhat disputed recently, in that we know that husk tannins exist, right? And we know that they exist in beer, and they're certainly extracted at higher temperatures and higher pHs.
Yeah.
So when you're adding in a higher pH water that's over 7 for most brewing water to a mash that's sitting around 5.2 to 5.6, you're going to raise the pH of the water. And if you get over 6 pH, you are extracting tannins into the wort. Now, the question is, how much, and are we going to make a noticeable difference?
Yeah.
And so that's why I say that this has been somewhat disputed recently, because we do know that you are extracting tannins, which can later lead to astringency in the beer. But what I think is less clear is how much of an impact that actually has on the final beer. And just my sort of opinion on it, it's probably pretty style dependent.
Yeah. I feel the same way. Yeah.
But yeah, and the other thing I always think about is, we have this thing called a decoction mash. And as part of a decoction mash, you're literally boiling a part of the mash, So regardless of 170 Fahrenheit or 67 C or higher temperatures, you're getting that liquid up to boiling. And that's not... I've had a lot of Pilsner Urquell, and I still haven't tasted anything astringent in it. Maybe some other weird flavors sometimes, but nothing astringent in that mash.
Yeah. The whole decoction thing was what made me not worry too much about overheating my sparge water. I mean, there were a few times where I'd forget that it was over the burner and it'd start boiling. Oh shit, I got to add this water to the grains. I don't want to wait for it to cool down. So I just pour it in there, and I never had issues with astringency in my beers. I've had other issues, but I'm telling you, astringency is not one of them. Now, we clearly, it seems like we don't have to be too concerned about the heat of sparge water, but again, we're sticking at that 170F, that 77C area for the most part. People started questioning a few years ago, well, why do we have to warm it up at all? It's kind of a pain. Again, you got to heat it again. It requires that energy. Would it be possible to mash with cooler water? And what are some of the concerns related to that? The only thing that I could think of when people started talking about this was, well, you're going to add cool water. It's going to stiffen that mash, and you're going to, again, like you said, adding cool honey, pouring out cool honey is going to go a lot slower and be less efficient, arguably, than if you warm that honey up and you try to get more of that honey out of the jar.
Yeah, for sure. And I think this was the original inspiration for what Ray did and why Ray did this experiment. There's a couple of guys out there that were doing experiments. Kai Troyster did one, and Michael Tonsmeyer also did an experiment on that. Kai Troyster, in his experiment, he actually did a specific experiment where he compared a beer that was sparged with cooler temperatures versus a beer that was sparged at sort of the normal temperatures. Now, there were some other changes that he made to the grist in that beer, but his results were pretty interesting, and I think his comments about it are really on point, which was one of the things he said was okay, sure, the runoff may be slower because the solution is more viscous, right? It's colder, It's more viscous. But if we're talking about efficiency, the sugar should have already dissolved, right? They shouldn't be any solid sugars left in the grains,
right?
So there shouldn't really be a result or there shouldn't be a reduced efficiency between doing a warm runoff versus a cold runoff. We're still rinsing all those sugars out. We're just moving them and adding liquid and getting those sugars to continue to get out of the grain, which I think is kind of a really smart point, in my opinion, and sort of raises the issue, okay, why are we doing it at this 170 F number? And then Michael Tonsmeyer, his stuff that he was doing, I can't remember exactly what he called it, but essentially he was trying to streamline his brewing process just by not having to use a hot liquor tank. He realized that, hey, I'm heating up the hot liquor over here, or I'm heating up this hot liquor tank, and then I have to have this other vessel to do it. What if I just ran the water hose into the top of the mash tun and let it rinse the grains? And he started doing that and had pretty successful results. Oh, was that a minimal sparge something like that, Marshall?
Yeah, something along
remember
those lines. And it was, it's fascinating, right? It's stuff like this that I love about homebrewers is that we're willing to try things because we don't have to, it's not a huge loss for us, right? It didn't work out. Oh, well, there's still beer there. It may not be the best. But when Michael did this, I remember thinking, what is he doing? And his experience was positive. It worked out, which just goes to show that, like you were saying, theoretically, you don't need warm water to rinse those sugars off. They've already been dissolved. They've already been converted. You got most of them in your first runnings anyways. But it was Michael's experience that I do believe inspired contributor Ray Found. He was very curious to see how sparging with cool water affects beer, and so he put it to the test. Results when we return. The brew-in-a-bag method has blown up over the last few years, and in that time, it's become very clear that not all bags are created equal. For the best BIAB experience, you have got to go with the Brew Bag. Made from high-quality, food-safe polyester, the Brew Bag is available in both 210 micron for standard brew-in-a-bag, as well as 400 micron, which works beautifully for all-in-one recirculating systems. I've been a Brew Bag user for years and wouldn't brew without it. Head over to brewinabag.com to get the fabric filter that works for you and use promo code TBP17 at checkout to receive a discount. Again, that's brewinabag.com. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the exGEERiment, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to exGEERiment.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. There are a lot of things in brewing that are accepted as hard fact, dogma, if you will, many of which involve temperature. Prior to reading about Michael Tonsmeyer's experience sparging with cool water, I'd never considered it as an option and was excited when Ray Found proposed an experiment to test it out using his standard batch sparge method. So for this one, he did a dual 5-gallon batches of his Make America Amber Again recipe, which is a phenomenal amber recipe. If you like amber ale, I would encourage you to make this recipe. It's delicious. For this one, he did 65% Gambrinus ESB pale malt, 20% Munich light, 8% C40, 4% C20, and 3% pale chocolate malt. And then these are dual batches. So he mashed those both at 149 degrees Fahrenheit or 65 degrees C. And then this is where the variable was introduced.
Yeah. So first of all, I love that recipe. Having brewed that beer, it's fantastic. But yeah, this is where he introduced the variable. So during the mash rests, he collected 2 identical volumes of sparge water and then adjusted them so that the mineral profile was the same. And then interestingly, so he left one of the buckets alone, and his groundwater at the time was 75F or 24C. So he just filled up one bucket with his groundwater at that temperature. Again, 75F or 24C. And then the other one, he heated up to standard sparge temperature of 172F or 78C. So 2 different buckets for the sparge water. So he let the mash rest for 60 minutes and then collected the first runnings from each batch before before the sparge waters were added to their respective batches. So just normal batch sparging process so far. Then he added the sparge water to each batch. So added the hot water to the hot batch and then the cool water to the cool batch, and measured each of the temperatures of the batches so that he could see what the actual grain was at after he did that. And the standard batch, so the one that got 170F 78C water added to it, was ultimately, the mash itself was at 155F or 68C, whereas the cool batch only got brought down to 93F or 34C, which is a pretty significant difference. I mean, that's 62 degrees Fahrenheit, 34 degrees Celsius difference.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting to me is 155F for the standard sparge, after adding 172 degrees Fahrenheit, sparge water, 155F is still well within conversion range. I mean, that is like a solid mash temperature. And so you're still getting that conversion. 93F is well under what we would expect conversion to take place. So if there is anything happening after that 60-minute mash, we should see something objective here, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I would think you would, especially at those temperatures. So theoretically, we talk about denaturing by raising temperatures too, but you can also denature by lowering temperatures. It's just a little bit more difficult. Well, not denature, but you can stop enzyme activity.
There you go. Yeah.
At lower temperatures. Just be clear about what I'm saying, so we don't get any feedback. But Ray did let both of the mashes settle for a few minutes before he collected the second runnings, and then this is sort of interesting. He did notice slightly lower volumes collected from this cool sparge batch, and a slightly lower pre-boil original gravity from the cooler batch, which I think is sort of interesting. So we had it at that lower temperature, right, well below the conversion temperature. So he noticed both a lower pre-boil OG, but also the volume was a little bit lower, which I think was sort of interesting.
Yeah, me too. It makes me wonder if there wasn't some sort of, again, I keep thinking of the honey, right? He said, I believe he noted that it was about a quart or a liter or so more you got more wort out of the warm sparge batch. And so again, you're going to get more honey out of the jar if it's warm than if it's cold. So that part sort of makes sense to me. The difference in OG, 0.002 specific gravity points isn't really that much. Nothing that you would taste a difference in, I don't think. Pre-boil especially. So that didn't surprise me, but it does kind of jibe with what I would think might happen if you are halting conversion.
Yeah, and I think this is really, so we were starting to see some objective differences in the batch. So I think it's interesting. I'm sure Ray was pretty excited to see something like that when doing this experiment. So to continue with the experiment, he boiled for 60 minutes, added his hops according to the schedule, which was 10 grams of Magnum at 60 minutes, and then 60 grams of Cascade, 40 grams of Amarillo, and 20 grams of Centennial at 15 minutes. So let the boil continue, and then both worts were chilled before he took gravity measurements, which the standard sparge batch after boiling, so going into the fermenter, was at 1.053 original gravity, and the cool sparge batch was at 1.051 OG, so only a 0.002 difference.
Yeah. And again, if your pre-boil's different, you're going to expect to see a similar difference post-boil. So this doesn't surprise me at this point, but it's just interesting. And again, kind of lines up with what I would expect from not sparging. Is this going to have a perceptible effect on the beer in the end? I'm fascinated by this at this point when Ray's telling me, we talked during our brew days and he's telling me that, we're starting to see some differences in OG. I think it's pretty interesting.
Yeah. Now I will say a 0.002 difference in OG isn't all that much, at least in my experience, but no. We are starting to see, so some differences maybe in this cool sparge versus the standard 170 degree sparge version. So Ray racked identical volumes of wort into the PET carboys, into his PET carboys, and let them chill in a chamber for a couple hours before they finished chilling. Now, I want to point this out too, because I think this is important. He did rack identical volumes. So even though there was a smaller volume into I think it was a quart, like you said, Marshall. He still racked the same amount into the fermenter for the purposes of keeping the experiment as similar as possible.
Yeah, and I think it's important as well. Some people will say, well, maybe he messed up and just added a quart more, hot water to the sparge of the other. The OG was higher, so if that was the case, you'd expect to see a lower OG. And Ray's a very good brewer. He's very astute. He wasn't adding extra water. He made sure they were identical volumes, so you had more wort coming out of the mash and also wort of higher OG. He did ferment these ones with Safale USO5, which isn't very common for him, but I think he wanted to keep things really simple. And so he rehydrated 2 pouches of Safale USO5 and pitched one into each batch and fermented them at 66 degrees Fahrenheit or 19 degrees C.
Yeah, then so he let it go for 11 days, and seeing that the beers had seemed to finish, he took final gravity readings, and they were at 1.010. Each beer achieved the same final gravity. So there was slightly lower attenuation in the cool sparge beer than in the warm sparge. Remember, they had a 2 gravity point difference at the beginning, and then evened out during fermentation, which I think is really interesting as well.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, with the data that we've got, the objectively measurable data that we've got, you've got cool sparge leading to a slightly lower OG with a slightly less volume of wort in the end, and now it's a slightly less attenuation as well. So for me, these are indicators that, okay, the cool sparge does have an impact. And clearly, objectively at least, these beers are different, right? I mean, not by much. We're not saying that that's drastic by any means, but clearly there's something going on with sparging with cooler water versus the warmer water. Is it going to cause a taste difference? At this point, as Ray's filling us in, right? He's been fermenting these things for a couple of weeks. He's telling us his FG stuff. I'm thinking, man, there's no way that these are going to be identical. I mean, when you've got objectively measurables, we have done so many experiments where all of the objectively measurable stuff is identical, and yet the beers taste different. I'm convinced at this point that these beers are going to be different, and that doesn't mean one's going to be bad or whatever, just that they're going to be different.
Yeah, I also love whenever we expect certain things out of an experiment, like when we expect to see a lower, efficiency maybe out of the colder batch, a lower original gravity, and then we also see lower attenuation. That also is interesting to me, because you're looking at this going, okay, well, this is making a lot of sense in terms of what people say about, cool crush or using a cooler water whenever you're sparging. So at this point, he cold crashed the beers overnight. He fined them with gelatin and then racked the beers to sanitize kegs, where he burst carbonated them overnight and then reduced gas to serving pressure. After 5 days of conditioning, he was ready to serve the beers.
And he did so, but not before evaluating them himself. To me, looking at the photos of these beers, they look identical. Everything about them is pretty similar. I don't know. What do you think, Cade?
Yeah, I mean, looking at the photos right now, they both look exactly the same. I mean, there's good clarity. God, that beer is so beautiful.
Yeah,
it's this nice red color, and I love a good American amber. That's probably my second favorite beer style, by the way.
Yeah,
but. Yeah, they look fantastic. Both batches look great, and I don't notice anything objectively about, any difference in appearance. Color, foam, all look the same.
Either did Ray in terms of the way they looked, but he also didn't notice any differences whatsoever in the way they tasted or smelled. So just on that alone, I was wrong because you again, I'm going off of the objective, the easily observable data, the OG, the FG, the attenuation, all that stuff, and I'm thinking clearly there's something going on. These are going to taste different. Ray said that he could not tell a difference whatsoever, despite there being a very slight difference in alcohol level, right? Because of the starting OG and both finishing at the same 1010 FG, they were identical to Ray's palate, and so thankfully when it's not COVID time, we do serve these beers to other blind participants so we can see what their sensory performance is between these two beers.
So he served the beers to 17 participants. So at 17 participants, we would need 10 participants in order to say that it was significant. But alas, he only had seven of the participants that actually got it right. So people were not able to tell these beers apart.
Yep. When you serve a triangle test to people, if the beers are identical, you expect about a third, give or take, to pick each beer, and that's exactly what happened here. 7 out of 17 is roughly a third. Yeah, obviously it's a little higher than a third, but 17 is kind of a low number. But only 7 people identified the odd beer out in this triangle test, which goes to show that these beers were not very different. Again, you can look at the numbers and say they are different. Yes, 100% they are, but people could not smell, taste, or feel in their mouths a difference between these beers, which just goes to show that sparging with cool water, 75 degree Fahrenheit water, did not have a, huge perceptible impact on these finished beers. Not only did this back up what Michael Tonsmeyer and Kai Troyster were saying about the perceptibility, the sensory aspects of cool sparging, but I think it opened a lot of people up to saving some time on their brew day. It certainly shocked me. I mean, I did not expect these results at all.
Yeah, I mean, we talked numbers, a 2-point difference in original gravity, and then a 2-point difference in OG, but the same final gravity, meaning there was a 0.26% ABV difference. And there are a lot of people out there, and I've talked to a lot of brewers that think that they would absolutely be able to distinguish an almost 0.3 difference in ABV. For them to not be able to distinguish these two beers was really interesting. And to me, the implications of this are, hey, maybe you don't need to have a separate vessel to keep hot water. If you want to just do like Michael Tonsmeyer did, I wouldn't run from your garden hose, but if you want to run, an RV hose or something to a faucet inside or something like that, or if you've got access to RO and can run RO over the top, this may be a way to do it where you don't have to have that additional vessel.
Yeah.
We saw that at least there was no noticeable perceptible difference in these. So I think this is a really fascinating one.
Yeah. And, one of the, I think kind of initial benefits that we were talking about as Ray was sharing these results, and we were, was that, you're going to save energy, you're going to save time. When you really think about it, that's not terribly accurate, because no matter what, you still have to bring that wort to a boil. And so it's going to require the same amount of energy to bring 94 degree Fahrenheit, wort up to 212 degrees Fahrenheit or 100 degrees C, as it is to bring up your sparge water to 170 Fahrenheit, and then now you've got this 153 degree Fahrenheit wort, give or take, that you're raising to 212. It's going to require the same amount of energy. That's just physics. That's the way thermodynamics or whatever works. So I'm not sure there's a huge benefit on that front. If it can save you more time, though, if you can figure out a way to sparge, if you're still sparging and you can use cool water, it saves you time. You don't have to buy as much gear. It seems to work, and I think that's really cool. Now, I think we do need to point out one little caveat, is that this could be a function of the sparge method used. It may be that these results wouldn't reproduce the same way if he didn't batch sparge, if he fly sparged, and that's something we can look at in the future. But as it stands with batch sparging, it really just doesn't seem to matter that much, and I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, I think for sure. Definitely looking at the sparge method itself, I think fly sparging, again, is meant to have continuous liquor going over the top, so you're continuously running water over it until you get to sort of the volume that you want, and or the gravity that you want. So those two things would have changed at least the objective numbers for this experiment. So that's certainly one thing. The other thing too is we talked a lot at the top of the show that what's important about the 170 number, or at least the theoretical 170 number, is getting the mash up to that temperature. So again, with the fly sparge, much easier to get the mash up to 170. So maybe not as much conversion or, going on at that 155 number. So those couple of things do sort of caveat the results in this, but still, I think you can certainly say that, at least the way that Ray did this, if you don't want to have that additional vessel to hold hot liquor, it certainly seems like you don't need to do that, at least at the homebrew scale, and under the conditions that Ray brewed his beer.
Yeah. I mean, I don't sparge anymore, but if I did, I'd certainly consider using cooler water. It looks like it works. It might save some time, some energy, some gear. So We've got some reader comments to get to. The first one comes from, I'm going to butcher this, Cade Lazarowski, who says, I used to kind of worry whether my sparge bed would reach that all-important 170 degrees, but once again, you all have shown that it is not something I need to fret over. Close is good enough. A possible experiment would be the opposite. If you brought your grain bed up to 200 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 93 C, would you get the dreaded tannin extraction?
I think, have we done a tannin extraction experiment yet, Marshall? Do you remember?
We've done a few interesting ones that seem to indicate that you're not going to extract tannins just based on the temperature alone. We know that tannin extraction science has shown, is a function of both heat, but more importantly, pH. And so, again, think about decoction. I mean, you're boiling grains. You're literally boiling your mash, and those are some of the smoothest beers. In fact, decoction is thought to contribute to a smoother, richer malt character. You're not getting tannin extraction from that. So I don't think a 200 degree Fahrenheit sparge water is gonna have an impact on astringency by any means. And like I said, anecdotally, I have batch sparged with boiling water, and it didn't ruin the beer. So
yeah, and I love the comment in there. Once again, close is good enough. For so much of my brewing, I've wanted to hit an exact number to get whatever exact measurable or whatever exact efficiency number that I was going for. One of the things that I've learned over my brewing career is, especially when I'm just brewing for myself, for my own personal consumption, close is good enough. Now, not necessarily whenever I'm doing experiments. When I'm doing experiments, I want to be exact, or as exact as I can be. But close is certainly good enough for me on my own personal consumption.
Yeah, and I think a point that we haven't hit on is for those people who aren't planning to start sparging with tap water, basically. Let's say it's wintertime in Minnesota and it's taking forever to get that sparge water up to 170 degrees. Maybe it's at 140, maybe it's at 150. You can sparge with it, and it's probably going to lead to a completely normal beer. In fact, perceptibly the same as what it would be if you sparged at 170. So close is definitely good enough, Sarah. Thanks for the comment. Our next one comes from Dakine. He says, you're wrinkling my brain over here. I sort of cool sparged one time when I accidentally ran short of sparge water and just made up the difference with my hose, but that was maybe a gallon or two. I've never even thought of foregoing 170 degree water. I'll need to mull this one over to determine if I'm going to change my process. Like you said, it takes a lot less time to heat 140 to 150 degree water to boiling than 90 to 100 degree water, and I heat up my sparge water during the mash, so I don't think I'd be saving any time.
Yeah, so this one, I think I could see some time savings, like you said, Marshall. If you're heating up your liquor, like you said, in Michigan or someplace where it's cold, and it's just taking a long time for that liquor to get up. If the liquor's at 140, or you forgot to turn the burner on, or you forgot to turn the element on at the beginning of the mash, maybe you instead of having to stop and wait and heat up let the mash sit at a longer time, you could just sparge with the water that you've got. I think, like you said, Marshall, that the physics of it are just what they are, right? Yeah. I mean, if you're raising the same amount of liquid up to the same temperature, so I can't imagine there's going to be too much savings in terms of energy efficiency or time necessarily. But maybe if you can cut out a step or something and don't have to, I guess to me it's more of, where do you want it to go? If I don't have to let the mash sit longer for 90 minutes or 120 minutes or something like that to heat up my water, maybe it's better to just let that go over in the boil kettle and just start heating up.
To me, it's a convenience thing. Like, knowing that you don't have to have it exactly 170, that magical number, it's convenient, Okay, cool. My water's too warm. My water's too cool. I'm just going to add it now. It's kind of nice to know that you can do that. So our next comment comes from Kevin LaRoche, who says, I've been interested in this for a while now. I brew on a Herm system and I perform a mash out. Not that I think a mash out will help my beer. It's simply a step to get to the sparge step. After the mash is done, I keep recirculating and raise the HLT temp to about 170 F. I drain the wort from the mash tun and then I batch sparge. I don't think the cold sparge method would help with my setup at all, even with a slightly more significant result. I appreciate the comment, Kevin, and I'm kind of with you. For me, I don't sparge at all anymore, but I still find this this experiment really interesting.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you're getting the grain bed up to 170 as your part of your mash out step, sparging with cool water is just going to undo what you did.
Yeah, exactly.
I think for your setup, I wouldn't change it if I were you. I know certainly whenever I was fly sparging, I never did a mash out step, raising the temperature of the grain, mostly because I was either in a cooler or a mash tun that you couldn't directly expose to heat.
Right.
Didn't have any sort of recirculation. But regardless of that, even when I was fly sparging, getting that temperature of the grain up to 170, I just achieved by putting hotter water in there.
Yeah.
So for your system, I don't think that's necessarily something that you should be worried about. If you're even worried about it almost 4 or 5 years later.
Yeah.
At this point.
All right. Reddit user Fat Dragon in the PRC says a cool water sparge is nice for brewing a bag since it makes squeezing the bag a lot easier and less painful. I've done both and never noticed any difference in the finished beers. Here we go. I'm telling you, convenience. I never would have even considered. I squeeze my bag a little bit every time I brew in a bag, and sure, it's hot. I put on those silicone gloves, and usually hot wort's going down into the gloves and getting on my hands. You dunk it in some cold water real quick and then squeeze. It's convenient. I think it's a good idea.
Yeah, so this is something I have been thinking about as I made the switch over to this e-brewing system, brewing in a basket, the Brow Supply e-brewing system. That's something that I've thought about is, I've got these grains sitting in this basket and they're just dripping, which is fine. I mean, I've had great efficiency in the mid 70s, good beers that have been produced from them. But I did kind of wonder, just because of my background doing fly sparging for so long, I did wonder what it would be like if I added some water and sort of rinse those grains over the top. So maybe this is a opportunity for another experiment here in the future on my system. But yeah, I kind of agree with that. I was thinking about that myself. I wonder if I could just eke a little bit more out, not because I need to, but just because you can, maybe.
Yeah. Final comment comes from Reddit user Unsung Savior 16, also known as our very own Matt Del Fiacco. He says, well, there goes heating my sparge water for now. I'm pretty sure this was before Matt joined our ranks, like very, very just before he joined the Brewlosophy crew, and now he generally brews using full volume mashing methods in the same system that you do, the Brow Supply system. So he apparently did stop heating his sparge water, just for different reasons, I guess. All right, that's all we've got on sparging with cool water. You got anything else for us, Cade?
No, I think that's it. I think we got this topic all done. If you have any questions or want to know anything else, just shoot us an email.
Yep. Don't forget, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on brewlosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.